Hello, everyone. This is Brian Ka with another episode to help you pass the California Baby Bar exam. So, in the previous video, we talked about many things, and I also shared my own experience in failing this test and also later on being able to pass the test. And I try to encourage you by saying that the percentage of people that have passed this test increase for the June 2024 exam. So rather than being bombarded with so many negative messages regarding this test that they're so difficult that they're almost impossible to pass. I wanted to leave you with a positive message saying that this is doable. And even though the test is not necessarily getting easier, because from my own experience, from taking the June 2024 baby bar exam, the questions were actually a lot harder than I expected because I was taking a lot of practice exams on bar max and I was getting around 88% to 90%. But when I finished the June 2024 exam, I didn't feel so good because the questions were very different from what I expected. And to be honest, I was expecting to see some repeats. If not repeats, I was expecting to see some questions that were similar. But when I took the test, I realized that the test was written in a totally different way. Although I have to admit that there were some fact patterns that were similar, the questions that they asked were way different than the previous questions. But I was trying to cheer you up, especially if you're one of those students who have failed this test in the past, like I have. I told you that I took this test 10 years ago when they tested on four essays and 100 multiple choice questions. I got 65 on three essays, which is a passing score, but I got 60 on one of them. But my MBE questions, I got half of them right. I got 50%. So I failed it the first time. And then I also told you that I had 10 years of break in between due to some life circumstances in which I was not able to pay for law school and go on to my second and third and fourth year of law studies. But after 10 years, I managed to never give up on finishing my law studies, and I ended up passing the 2024 June baby bar exam. And now I am in my second year of law studies, currently in community property and child advocacy class. And it's already been 3, 4 months, meaning this trimester, these two classes are already finished. And it seems like yesterday when I started talking about my second year of law studies, but time goes by so fast. And when I also returned back to law school, 3 years seemed like a long time. But considering that 3 months have already passed, almost 4 months now. So if you count, I have what, around 2 years and 7 or 8 months left in law school, and time goes really, really fast. There was a gentleman who recorded a video in our school uploaded it on YouTube, and he was 70 years old. He was a cancer research scientist that decided to enroll in law school at the age of 66. And when he recorded himself to talk about his experiences at my law school, he was 70 years old. And whenever I was kind of getting down on the fact that I have so many friends who have been attorneys for now, I would say 15 years, 16 years now. And here I am at the age of, 40, trying to finish what I've started. And sometimes I feel like it's too late, and a lot of negative thoughts cross my mind. But nonetheless, I am like the type of person that doesn't like to give up no matter what happens in life. Once I start something or decide to start something and finish, I have to do it no matter what. And as you can see from my life, having 10 years of break, a lot of things happened in between, and still managing to come back and redo my second, third, and fourth year at a 4-year law school. I wanted to tell you that it's never too late. And that's what that 70-year-old cancer research scientist was trying to say, is that it's never too late. And I wanted to just encourage you, if you ever feel like it may be too late. And also, there was a person that said something along the lines of, if you're 40 now, you're going to be 50. No matter what you do, you're going to turn 50 or you're going to turn 60. But would you rather be 50 with a law degree as an attorney, or would you rather be 50 without a law degree and passing the baby bar exam? And I'm sure most of you or all of you will answer saying that you'd rather be 50 or 60 years old with a law degree, having passed the bar exam. So those are just two or couple anecdotes I wanted to share in case you are getting down on yourself, which is natural because it's happened to me a lot of times, and it's still happening to me. But I look at those people that are trying to do this at 70 years old, and when you watch people like that talk about their life, it kind of lifts you up. And that is the reason why I brought that story up. That is the reason why I'm sharing my story with you, so that if you ever feel like it's too late, it's not too late. As long as you put your mind into it and tell yourself that no matter what happens, you're just going to keep going and never give up, regardless of whether it's going to take you 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. It doesn't matter. And once you start comparing yourself with other people, then that's when you get into this negative mindset, because like I said in the beginning of this video, that some of my friends have been attorneys now for 16, 17 years. And when you start comparing, then you kind of get down on yourself. But you're not going to be the same type of person when you start practicing law, meaning you're going to have your own strengths. Of course, you're going to have weaknesses, but like, for example, me, I think I would be a good trial lawyer because of everything that has happened in my 30s late 20s, all the hardships that I faced once I turned, 40. I think all of that they're gonna end up helping me propel forward because I've gained some insights and perspectives that I would have never gained unless I went through all that stuff, all the hardship. Even now, things happening in my life which is just not understandable happening to me. But my mind is now where I keep telling myself that unless there is pain, there is no gain. Like I was hiking last weekend and I was hiking barefooted and I was walking through the trail, and because I was walking barefooted, my feet hurt a lot, right? But I don't know if you're aware of Chinese or Asian reflexology. It means that on your feet, there are many spots that correspond to your internal organs. And when you walk barefooted, it's going to hurt, right? But when it hurts, because it corresponds to your internal organs, that pain actually does good things because in Asian medicine, all your internal organs are on your feet. So even though if you're walking on these round or sharp rocks and you step on it, and it may hurt a lot, but when I came home, I felt refreshed. And why am I talking about this? When I was walking barefooted, I had a lot of pain. It was very painful. But because of that pain, I gained a lot, meaning I got healthier. I was able to feel myself, my internal organs, just feeling a lot better as a result of this reflexology, which I did to myself instead of getting it massaged. I was walking barefoot on all these rocks for like 2 miles. So remember that sometimes in life you may go through a lot of pain, not understand why you have to go through that pain, but also remember that unless there's pain, and this may not be the case in all scenarios, but generally, in my opinion, unless there is pain, there is no gain. So, with that, we're going to do questions 12 through 21, or actually 12 through 21, because in my previous video, we did 1 through 11. So, in this video, we're going to start with number 12, and hopefully, the second set of videos, the second set of questions will help you if you fail the baby bar exam or if you're looking to take it, but you can't afford to have a tutor or you can't afford to pay expensive bar preps, baby bar preps. Hopefully, this video will help you to pass the exam and save money and benefit you in more than one way. So, with that, let's read question number 12. All right. So, Axel wrote Grant saying, please ship 175 Model X hearing aids per catalog price. Grant shipped 175 Model Y hearing aids, which are superficially similar to Model X and can be distinguished only by taking them apart. Model Y is an obsolete model with no market demand. On tender of delivery, Axel discovered the discrepancy and demanded that Grant deliver Model X hearing aids. Grant refused. If Axel sues for breach of contract, what result? So, what are they asking here? They're asking that if in a UCC contract, as you know, UCC contracts have to do with sales of goods, right? And if a party ships something, in this case, 175, offers a contract in which they ask the other party to ship 175 Model X hearing aids per catalog price, right? And the other party ends up shipping something else. Is that a breach? Well, in UCC sale of goods, we know that there is a perfect tender rule, meaning unless the shipper sends items that are in conformity or perfect tender of what the order was about, then that would be a breach. Now, if there is enough time left for performance, the person who sent the items that are not perfect tender of what the buyer was seeking, they have the right to cure. But in this particular scenario, Axel wanted Grant to ship 175 Model X hearing aids. Grant shipped 175 Model Y hearing aids. And they tell you that Model Y hearing aids are superficially similar, right? And can be distinguished only by taking them apart. And that is a trick question because if you know that under the perfect tender rule, if anything is not in conformity in which the sender doesn't ship anything that is not a perfect tender of what the buyer wanted, if you know that rule, then you know that this is a breach. But if you don't know that rule, if you read this part where it says it's basically indistinguishable and it's so similar that it doesn't really matter, then if you're gonna buy into that trick thinking, okay, it's basically the same thing, and if they shipped something so similar, then it wouldn't matter. But under the perfect tender rule, that would be a breach, right? Now, on tender of delivery, the buyer discovered the discrepancy and demanded that Grant deliver Model X hearing aids, right? And the shipper refused. So because the shipper shipped something that was not in perfect tender of what the buyer wanted, and when the buyer found out there's a discrepancy and asked the shipper to send something that is in conformity what he originally ordered, and the shipper refused, that's a breach, By who? By the person who shipped non-conforming goods, right? So if Axel sues for breach of contract, what would happen, right? He would win. So knowing that there is a breach here because of the perfect tender rule, if they talk about Grant winning, you know that's automatically wrong. So let's look at A. Grant wins because there was no meeting of the minds. That's wrong because we know that Axel is going to win, right? So A is wrong. Let's look at B. Grant wins because his shipment was only a counter offer which Axel rejected. Obviously, that's wrong because in this case, Axel is going to win because he didn't receive the perfect tender of what he ordered, right? Let's look at C. Axel wins because the offeror is master of his offer. Well, offeror is the master, but that is very irrelevant to this question. They're asking about perfect tender and breach. So let's just leave C and let's read D if that may be the right answer. D says, Axel wins because Grant's shipment of Model Y hearing aids constituted an acceptance of Axel's offer to buy Model X hearing aids. Well, what they're basically saying is that this contract was not a bilateral contract. It was a contract for performance, meaning a party said, ship something. In this case, ship 175 Model X hearing aids. And the other party accepted that offer, right? By performance. So when he shipped something, in this case, Model 175 Model Y hearing aids, that was an acceptance of Axel's original offer, right? So there was a contract, right? Because he accepted by sending, in this case, he sent 175 Model Y hearing aids, which was not a perfect tender. But regardless, that was an acceptance of an offer by Axel, right? So here we know that Axel is going to win. And when Grant shipped Model Y hearing aids, right, that was an acceptance. Whether or not that would be a breach is another question, right? But what this D, the answer D is saying is that Axel wins because he was supposed to get 175 Model X hearing aids, and Grant accepted by sending 175 Model Y aids. Aids. Now the problem here is that again he sent 175 Model Y hearing aids, which was a breach, right? Because Axel was supposed to receive 175 Model X hearing aids. So he did accept, but he breached because he was supposed to receive 175 Model X hearing aids. And that's what D is saying. D is saying Axel wins because when Grant shipped Model Y hearing aids, he accepted the offer, right? But he didn't send Model X hearing aids. So that would be a breach. And that's another way of saying D, but it's basically saying the same thing. I know that this question is kind of not crystal clear, but when you look at A, B, C, D, you know that D is the best answer. They always give you like two answers that look good, sound good, but when you really get into the reasoning behind it, one answer, if you have two answers that look good, one of them will have a reasoning that is far better than the other answer choice that you liked, in my experience. All right, so let's look at number 13. So, owner owned a house in city. A storm sewer owned and operated by city ran under part of owner's house. Water from the sewer main escaped into the basement of owner's house, flooding the basement and causing substantial damage. The jurisdiction in which city is located has abolished governmental tort immunity. If owner asserts a claim against city, the basis on which owner is most likely to prevail. Okay, so the owner is trying to sue city for something, right? So that would be a tort question because obviously this is not a contractual issue. This is not a criminal law issue because you have a party suing another party. Even though it's against the city, it's still party A suing party B, right? Well, we know that this is not going to be intentional tort because there is in this fact pattern, a storm sewer that was owned and operated by city. Something happened to it, right? What happened to it? Water from it escaped into the basement of owner's house. And obviously, the city didn't intend this to happen. So, and this is probably not going to be, product liability question or strict liability question. It's not something that is inherently dangerous. And the call of the question doesn't really sound like a product liability question. So, what's the only choice that we have here? This is probably a negligence question because the plaintiff here, the house owner, would be a foreseeable plaintiff. I'm sure you learned about the pause graph and whether or not plaintiff was in the zone of foreseeability, or anybody can be a plaintiff. I'm sure you went over that. I'm sure you went over breach of that duty, and I'm sure you went over but for and foreseeability causes that are necessary to prove negligence, and lastly, you need to have damages. So this is probably going to be a negligence question. City owing a duty to a foreseeable plaintiff, breaching that duty, which is the cause in fact, but for, and foreseeability causing damages. So let's look at A, B, C, D. Let's look at A. If owner asserts a claim against city, the basis on which owner is most likely to prevail would be negligence. There you go. If the sewer was a sewer main was improperly constructed or maintained, right? Because if it was improperly constructed, if it was not maintained right, that would be a breach because they had a duty which was breached, right? So A, right away, I would choose that answer. But let's just look at B, C, or D. Strict liability, because the water escaped from city's sewer main. Well, Strict liability to me would be like plaintiff running a manufacturing plant that in which something crazy dangerous leaked. Like this is so dangerous that if it touches your skin, that it may burn. That may be like a strict liability question, or like they were working at a construction site, but they were working with dynamites, which is inherently dangerous. But here, it doesn't seem like a inherently dangerous type of question. So B, I would cross it out, right? C, strict liability in tort if the sewer main was defective. Well, I guess what they're trying to ask is whether this was a product liability question, right? But here the question seems to be asking for negligence, not really a product liability here, right? They're not even talking about the manufacturer of the sewer line. They're talking about the city. If this was a product liability question, that would talk about either a retailer, either the party that constructed it, or the designer, or something like that, right? But there's no mention of that here. So this is not going to test you on, well, this particular question is not testing you on product liability. So C is wrong. D is nuisance because owner's use of enjoyment of his house was interfered with. This is not a nuisance case either. Well, nuisance would be like a substantial interference with one's right and enjoyment of property, right? And you could have either public nuisance and private nuisance. And in order to prove private nuisance, you need to suffer harm that was different from everybody else, if I can recall correctly. Remember, this was like 4 months ago. I haven't touched towards criminal law and contracts for like 4 or 5 months. So I may not be like 100% on everything, but I think that's the gist of it. And this is not really about, you know, whether or not city substantially interfered with a nuisance. I mean, substantially interfered with one's right and enjoyment of property. This is not really a nuisance case. So it's A. It's a negligence case. They had a duty, breach of that duty, cause and fact, foreseeability, and damages. So A is the right answer. All right, so let's continue. All right, so Daniel owned a restored classic automobile made in 1922. To discourage tampering with the car, Daniel installed an electrical device designed to give a mild shock, enough to warn but not to harm persons touching the car. Paul, a heart patient with a pacemaker, saw Daniel's car and attempted to open the door. Paul received a mild shock which would not have harmed an ordinary individual, but which caused his pacemaker to malfunction, resulting in a fatal heart attack. If Paul's estate asserts a claim against Daniel for the wrongful death of Paul, will the estate prevail? Well, the first thing that came to my mind is when I read this fact pattern is the eggshell plaintiff rule, right? You must find plaintiff as you find them, right? Meaning, if a person was injured because of negligence and he already had a precondition that made his injury worse, then you have to find the victim as you find them. Meaning, again, the fact that he already had a precondition, pre predisposition, which made his injury worse in comparison to other people. You still have to compensate the the injured party as you find them, right? But there's also another thing here in which they seem to be asking about your knowledge on defenses to property. As you know, using any deadly force to protect property is never allowed. Even in criminal law, you can't use deadly force unless you're confronted with, you know, deadly force or harm, or you're facing imminent death. That would be a different situation. But generally, you can't use deadly force to protect your property or even your home. I heard that in Texas, they have this thing called the castle doctrine, in which they are allowed to use deadly force if somebody encroaches upon your home. But this is California, and we are different here. In California, you can't use deadly force unless you're confronted with imminent death or great bodily harm, right? So just because somebody comes into your house to commit burglary, for example, but they don't seem to be a threat of any kind. You saw that that person didn't have a gun or any weapons, and they said that they're about to just go away. You can call the police, but when it comes to shooting them, you may be in legal jeopardy. And I don't really like this law because, you should be able to protect your home. But when it comes to using deadly force in California to protect property or protect your home, it seems like our law is a lot different. So here we know that Daniel had a car and he set up something, a property. He was trying to protect property without deadly force, right? They tell you that it's enough to warn, but not to harm persons touching the car, right? So does he have the right to do that? Set up something that is not deadly force, but a reasonable way to protect his property from harm, right? Even though they kind of tell you that this is a eggshell plaintiff in which you shall find the victim as you find them, and even though he was somebody who was trying to open the door, do you still find Daniel, who's trying to protect his property with reasonable force, do you find him guilty? Well, I don't think so. You know, I think this question is asking whether or not you are aware of the rule that when it comes to protecting your property, deadly force is never allowed. However, reasonable force may be allowed. But just in case, let's read over the questions and see if we can arrive at the right answer. So A says, No, if Daniel was not using excessive force to protect his car, right? Well, what happened here? Paul received a mild shock. This would have not harmed an ordinary individual, but he had a pacemaker which malfunctioned, right? And and it resulted in a fatal heart attack. If he was using deadly force, let's say his car had this trap gun which went off if anybody tried to get in, and if Paul died, then in that case, Daniel would be 100% liable because deadly force is never allowed, right? But here they're talking about reasonable force. So A sounds okay, sounds good, but I'm not sure. So let's just look at B, C, or D. B is no because Paul was a trespasser. Well, Paul was a trespasser, but that reasoning doesn't sound too good, right? Well, if Paul's estate, Paul who died, estate, and his estate is trying to assert a claim against Daniel for using reasonable force to protect his property, they're telling you that Paul's estate will lose because Paul was a trespasser. Well, the conclusion seems okay, but the reasoning doesn't sound too great, right? Not as good as A. So let's look at C. Yes, because Daniel's act was a substantial factor in causing Paul's death. Well, they're saying that because they can prove that causation, one of the elements, because you need two elements for causation to prove this, right? Usually you have to prove both cause and fact and whether it was foreseeable. But here, just because you can prove that protecting his property with reasonable force was a substantial factor, that's not going to prove Paul's estate's case, right? If they're trying to sue him for negligence, they'll still have to prove, duty, breach, causation, damages. So having just one element out of all that is not going to be a successful lawsuit, right? I know the reasoning of these MBE questions might be a little off, but I think that from my experience, it's important to learn the way these test writers think, which is really weird. It's not like a common sense type of reasoning, but they have a certain way to reason these questions to arrive at the right answer. So I'm just going by my feeling or my experience on how these test takers like to test. This has nothing to do with the way I think. If I had it in my way, I would never write these tests like this because it's confusing as hell, right? And it's not clear, and you don't really know what they're asking. You're like, huh? But that's the way it is, right? D is yes, if Paul had no reason to suspect the presence of the electrical device. Well, that doesn't really prove anything. Just because Paul had no reason to suspect, right? Is that enough for the estate to prevail under negligence theory? Probably not, right? So A seems like the best answer, even though It's not the perfect answer. No way this is a perfect answer. But if I had to choose between A, B, C, D, I would definitely choose A, right? And the rule that they're testing you is not the eggshell plaintiff rule. They want you to fall into that trap, but rather you have to focus on whether or not you knew about defense of property, whether you knew about or you know about using excessive deadly force versus reasonable force. And in this particular case, he was using reasonable force, right? Which is allowed. So A would be the answer. I really didn't like that question. I'm sure you really don't like this question either, but that's how I would arrive at the answer. A is the answer. So let's go to 15. Okay. Bill borrowed a television set from Len to watch a football game on Sunday afternoon. Bill promised Len that he would return the set to Len by 7 o'clock Sunday night because Len wanted to watch a program at 10 o'clock that night. When Bill had not returned the set by 9 o'clock, Len went to Bill's house. Bill was not at home, and Len forced open a window, climbed in, took his television set, and walked out with it. Did Len commit burglary? Okay, so they tell you exactly what they're testing you on. They're testing you on your knowledge of burglary, right? So what's burglary? Burglary would be breaking and entering, right? Another person's dwelling house. In common law, you needed the nighttime requirement at nighttime to commit felony therein, right? So what's going on here, right? The first element, breaking and entering, right? Bill wasn't home and Len forced open a window. That element is satisfied, right? And he climbed in. That's breaking and entering. Is this another person's dwelling house? Yes, because they tell you that it's Len that went to Bill's house, right? So he broke and entered another person's dwelling house at nighttime because they tell you 7 o'clock Sunday night. He wanted to watch the program at 10. And when Bill had not returned the set by 9 o'clock at night, so this is a nighttime requirement and it happened during nighttime, right? The last element that you need to prove a burglary case is whether or not the person, defendant, went in there to commit a felony therein, right? So, did he go in there to commit a felony therein? The facts tell you that what? He went to Bill's house to do what? To take his own television set back, right? So his intent, because we all know that in criminal law, you need mens rea, actus reus. Mens rea meaning what's going on in your head, right? Actus reus, the act, right? Which is voluntary. And some bar prep, I think they tell you that these two things has to happen at the same time simultaneously. But we don't really need to worry about that in this particular question. What they're asking you is, did he have the intent that would satisfy the elements of burglary? And the answer is no. He didn't go there to steal something that wasn't his because that was his own television set. That wouldn't be a felony, or he didn't have the intent to commit a felony therein. So what would be number 15? 15, let's read it. A says, yes, because Len broke and entered Bill's dwelling at night. Well, we already talked about this, right? Can he be liable for burglary by breaking and entering at night without the intent? No. So A is wrong. B, yes, because Bill had lawfully obtained possession of the television set from Len. Well, the question is whether he committed burglary, right? And we know that he didn't. So right away when they say yes, you know that's wrong, right? And the fact that he had lawfully obtained possession of the television set has really nothing to do with whether he had an intent to commit felony therein. So B is wrong. Let's look at C. No, because Bill was not home when Len went to his house. What does that have to do anything with by what does that have to do anything with trying to prove burglary? None, right? It's breaking and entering another person's dwelling house at nighttime to commit felony therein. So C is wrong. Let's look at D. No, because Len entered for the purpose of recovering his own television set. That's correct because we already decided before reaching answer D that he didn't have the intent to commit a felony therein. He was trying to go retrieve his own television set. And for the purposes of the bar exam, they love to test you on this, or the baby bar exam. Usually, if you're trying to go retrieve something that's yours, that wouldn't be enough to prove his intent to commit a felony. So D is the right answer. All right. So let's look at question 16. Bank had a substantial increase in the number of robberies at its main office. Bank hired Sharp, an expert rifleman, and placed him at a position where he could observe the entire floor of the bank through an opening in the ceiling of the bank. Sharp was instructed to shoot if he believed that it was necessary to prevent a robbery. Several days after Sharp had been hired, Rob entered the bank, pointed a gun at a cashier, and demanded money. When Sharp saw Rob point a gun at a cashier, Sharp fired and killed Rob. What criminal offense, if any, did Sharp commit? Okay, so it seems to be asking for defense of others or defense of property. Either one, right? We discussed earlier that using deadly force to protect one's property, protect others, right, is never allowed in California unless you're trying to stop a dangerous felony, unless you're you're trying to prevent somebody from committing imminent deadly harm, facing imminent death, right? Unless those things happen, you can't use deadly force. So what happened here? A guy was hired to shoot, right? Which is a very risky thing, right? But if you read the facts carefully, they tell you the guy who was trying to rob a bank pointed a gun at a cashier and demanded money. And I think that for this question, what you need to focus on is the fact that the robber pointed a gun, right? And that's causing serious risk of harm or imminent death, right? And that should trigger you right away. And you should know that there are only certain circumstances in which deadly force is allowed, right? And this is one of those exceptions, right? Because he pointed a gun as if he was about to shoot and he was about to commit a dangerous felony, a robbery, right? Using a gun, and he pointed at it. And when using deadly force, I told you that there are only a couple exceptions, and one of them is if you see somebody trying to commit a dangerous felony, and on top of that, somebody was facing imminent harm or death, risk of harm or death, right? And this problem seems to want you to answer that yes, dangerous, deadly force is never allowed, but in this fact pattern falls into one of those exceptions, right? So let's look at the answer choices. What criminal offense did Sharp commit? None if Sharp reasonably believed his act was necessary to prevent a dangerous felony. Well, I don't really know if that's the best answer out of the four, but out of the four, if I don't see anything better, I would probably go with that. Because they tell you that he his belief was reasonable, first of all, and his reasoning, second, was to prevent a dangerous felony. And I told you that using deadly force, there are only like three or four exceptions. In California, using deadly force to protect your home even is a very risky thing. That's one thing I learned after studying criminal law all these years is that using deadly force is a very risky thing, right? Even if somebody is trying to rob your home, unless you're faced with imminent death or serious risk of harm, right? But in this case, you know, he was trying to prevent a dangerous felony because the robber had his gun out and he was pointing at somebody, right? And in that belief was reasonable. So A could be the answer. But let's look at B, voluntary manslaughter, because Sharp used deadly force to protect private property. Well, voluntary manslaughter, they're trying to ask you about that. Well, the first thing about voluntary manslaughter, if you remember, is usually it's like a heat of passion, and you also have to know that there was not enough time to reflect, right? But this is not really a heat of passion thing. Now, if you're talking about imperfect defense, self defense, that would be involuntary manslaughter, but this is not really a imperfect self defense kind of fact pattern, right? And this is not a really a heat of passion type of question which will lessen his murder crime down to a voluntary manslaughter. That's not really it. So I would cross out B. C says voluntary manslaughter because Sharp did not first warn Rob. Well, voluntary manslaughter again has nothing to do with whether or not Sharp, you know, tried to warn Rob and he tried to force him to back away. That it's not really a common thing you see on any of these criminal law questions. So I would cross out C also, right? Murder if Sharp deliberately aimed to kill Rob. Well, they're asking you if you know about first degree murder, right? Premeditation and deliberation, right? That's the definition of murder, first degree murder. But they're actually testing you on whether you know the defenses to murder, right? In which you're allowed to use deadly force. So is probably the right answer and the best answer here. So I would go with A, right? Because D is, asking you for murder, not considering the fact that there may be a good case for defense here, defense of others, defense of property here. So I would go with A. Let's continue with question 17. Mike was employed as a salesman in Leo's store. Leo owned a beautiful clock which Mike had often admired. The clock needed repairs, and Leo asked Mike to take it with him on his way home and leave it at a repair shop. When asked to do this, Mike decided to keep the clock for himself. Mike took the clock, did not deliver it to the shop, and did not return work for Leo. Did Mike commit larceny? Well, what's larceny? Larceny is you're taking and carrying away another person's property, right? And what's the intent? The intent is to permanently deprive of another person's property. So you're taking and carrying away another person's property with intent to permanently deprive, right? So in this question, you know that the actus reus part, which is taking and carrying away another person's property, right? Did that really happen? Right? Yeah, because the clock needed repairs, and Leo asked Mike to take it with him on his home and leave it at a repair shop, right? So he took and carried away another person's property. But the crux of this question is whether when he took and carried away another person's property, did he have the intent to permanently deprive that, whatever it is, from the owner? And the fact pattern here says when he was asked to take and carry another person's property, which was not his, obviously, it says Mike decided to keep the clock for himself, right? So when Leo asked him to take and carry it away, his mens rea was to take it, right, for himself. So larceny does exist here. So did Mike commit larceny? Yes. I just told you the reasoning why. So you can basically cross out D, C, and D because it says no, because he did. Well, let's look at C. No, because Mike was Leo's servant when Leo gave Mike the clock. We don't really use the word servant, right? But the fact that it was Leo's servant or employee doesn't make a difference here. So C is wrong. D, no, because Leo transferred possession to Mike without any act or inducement on Mike's part. Well, the element of larceny is taking and carrying away another person's property, right? So the fact that there was any act or inducement is irrelevant. So we're left with A and B. Did Mike commit larceny? Yes, because after he received the clock, Mike did not take it to the repair shop. Well, he did, and he didn't take it to the repair shop. He wanted to keep it. So the reasoning is not that great. Because we want an answer that talks about his intent, mens rea. Because that's what this question is asking you for. Let's look at B. Yes, because when he received the clock from Leo, Mike had a secret intention to keep it. Yes. He received the clock from Leo, and what was his mens rea? He decided to keep the clock for himself. And what is B talking about? The fact that Mike had a secret intention to keep it. They tell you intentioned. So B is the right answer here because they kind of make it obvious. And one thing about these questions is that sometimes in the right answer choice, you'll see a black letter law, like just a rehash of the black letter law that they want you to know, right? So, for example, like if they're testing you on larceny, right? They're gonna literally tell you in the right answer, like intention, right? Like if they're asking you for burglary, they're gonna include a word like nighttime. I know that this sounds kind of new to you, but a lot of times they repeat in the right answer one of the words that are elements that are required to satisfy whether if they're asking you for larceny, you know whether you know that one of the elements is you know the intent to permanently deprive, and they'll literally write intent in the right answer. And in this question in B, they write intent, secret intention to keep it, and that's the right answer. So we just have a couple more. Bear with me. On December 20th, 1979, Carl, owner of Carl's Coffee Shop, entered into a written contract with Dan, owner of Dan's Donut Factory, under which Carl agreed to purchase his donut requirements for the calendar year of 1980. The contract provided that Carl shall have no obligation to receive any specified quantity of donuts, but only his daily requirements, and that Dan agrees to supply such requirements at the fixed price per dozen specified in the contract. Cash on delivery. During 1979, Carl's requirements of donuts for his coffee shop averaged approximately 50 dozen per week. So they mentioned requirements how many times? One, two, three, four times, maybe more. But from what I see in my cursory view, they mentioned requirements four times, right? So they must be testing you on requirements contract. And what do you know about requirement contract is that it's valid, right? Because they usually ask you whether they give you a requirements contract fact pattern, and they ask you whether there is sufficient consideration, right? Because one party, promising in good faith to fulfill the requirements of the other is valid consideration as long as the demand is not substantially disproportionate from the stated estimate. Meaning, like, if a requirements contract was 150 donuts per month, if you ask 1,000 donuts, that would be in violation of a requirements contract, because even though it may be in good faith, that is a number that is substantially disproportionate from the stated estimate, right? If it was like 155 and the requirement was 150 per month, that's not too disproportionate. So that wouldn't be a breach, right? So the thing you have to know about requirements contracts is that it needs to be in good faith. One party has to try his best to sell, right? And the other party has to do it, be in good faith to try to promote, and not close the business just for the sake of you know just closing it. You have to do your due diligence, right? So the good faith requirement and not unreasonably disproportionate are two things that you should always remember about requirements contract. And that if they're asking you whether requirements contract has sufficient consideration, you always have to know that yes, requirements contract under the UCC is a valid contract, right? So 18 is asking, early in 1980, Dan experienced a rise in his costs and decided he could no longer afford to supply Carl's requirements at the price fixed in their agreement, right? If Dan asserts that the agreement is not binding upon him because of lack of consideration, will Dan prevail? No, right? Because I just told you that, if Dan is trying to say that there's no consideration in a requirements contract, I just told you that requirements contracts, there is consideration in them, as long as I like what I just said, as long as it fulfills the good faith requirement and a unreasonably disproportionate requirement, right? So you know that A and B is wrong, right? Because if he argues that there is no not sufficient consideration because it was a requirements contract, you know, he's gonna lose. So the fact that they say yes because requirements contract lack mutuality of obligation, that's wrong. It doesn't lack mutuality of obligation. B, yes, because the provision that Carl had no obligation to receive any specified quantity made the contract illusory, right? Illusory contract is kind of like a party stating in a contract saying, I have the right to, get out from this contract anytime I want. That would be like an illusory contract. But here, we know that a requirements contract is valid, right? And the fact that they're kind of saying that, this is a illusory contract because it was a requirements contract, that's a wrong answer. So let's look at C. No, because requirements contract do not need consideration to be enforceable. That's the wrong answer because the fact that one party is requiring a stated estimate and the other party in good faith promise to deliver it is enough consideration. So there is consideration. C is wrong. Let's look at D. No, because Carl's agreement to buy his requirements was sufficient consideration for Dan's agreement to supply those requirements. That's the right answer, right? They tell you that an agreement by one party to buy requirements that they needed was a consideration, right, by the other party, a promise by the other party to supply those requirements. So 18 is D. Okay, let's look at 19. Assume that on May 1st, 1980, Carl opened Carl's Coffee Shop number 2 in a new office building. During the first 4 months of 1980, Carl had ordered an average of 50 dozen donuts per week from Dan. The first week in May, he ordered 75 dozen donuts, explaining that he needed the larger quantity because of the opening of Carl's Coffee Shop number 2. Dan refused to supply any more than 50 dozen at the price fixed in the agreement. Is Dan justified, right? Well, we just talked about whether requirements contract, to know that whether they're valid, you have to know that it was made in good faith, and whether a party, if a party wants a requirement that is, unreasonably disproportionate from the stated estimate, then those two things would get in the way. Not having those things would get in the way of a requirements contract validity, right? So is Dan justified in his refusal? Well, Dan was supposed to supply 50, around 50, right? And for 1 month, the person who Dan contracted with, Carl, demands 75. Is that unreasonably disproportionate from a stated estimate? Well, that's like asking for 50% increase, right? If it was 100% increase, that would be like 100, right? But, going from 50 to 75 and considering that it's like almost like 50% increase, that would probably be an unreasonable disproportionate amount, right? If it was like 55, that would be okay, right? But for the purposes of baby bar exam, if they jump from 50 to 75, just know that that is not a valid requirements demand by a party, because that would be unreasonably disproportionate from the stated estimate, right? So we know that because it was unreasonably disproportionate, if Dan was asked to provide 75 instead of the normal estimate of 50, and if he refuses, then what? He has the right to refuse because that's not close to a stated estimate of 50. So is he justified in his refusal? Yes, because he asked for 75 instead of 50. And again, if it was like 55, if the other party asked for 55, that wouldn't really be a unreasonable disproportionate amount. But going from 50 to 75 for the purpose of the baby bar exam, that is unreasonably disproportionate. So Dan would be justified in refusing to supply 75 in this case. So we know that it's going to be a yes answer. Is Dan justified in his refusal? Yes, if the normal requirements of the original coffee shop are approximately 50 dozen per week. Yeah. Again, I told you many times that a requirements contract is valid as long as it was made in good faith and not unreasonably disproportionate from the stated estimate. And A right away tells you that Dan would be justified in refusing to supply if what the requirements contract, which the both parties contracted for, was around 50 dozen per week. So A would be the right answer, but let's look at B. Yes, because the opening of Carl's coffee shop was number two was unanticipated occurrence, which excused Dan from his contract with Carl. Again, they're talking about requirements contract and your knowledge of unreasonable disproportionate element. So B is wrong, right? It's not even close. And C and D, they're both no. So you know it's wrong. But let's look at C. No, because the agreement provided that Dan would supply Carl's requirements of donuts at the fixed price. Well, what does having a requirements contract at a fixed price have anything to do with this question? It's kind of off. And if you do a lot of these, you just know it's off, right? So C is not right. D, know if in opening Carl's coffee shop number two, Carl relied on his requirement contract with Dan. I guess they're trying to get at like a detrimental reliance, but requirement contract is doesn't have a detrimental reliance element in it. So D is wrong, even though it sounds like pretty cool, right? So A would be the right answer. We just got two more questions. Assume that in May, Carl decided the price fixed in his contract with Dan was too high, since Carl was making a profit of 1.5 cents per donut. Carl asked Dan to agree to charge a lower price, but Dan refused. Okay. Carl thereupon stopped selling donuts in his coffee shop and switched to other pastries, right? If Dan sues Carl for breach of contract, who will prevail? Again, requirements, requirements, requirements. They put requirements four times in a question. They ask you about unreasonable, disproportionate element. And now it seems like they're asking you for a good faith element, right? Now, to know whether or not a party to a requirements contract acted in good faith, you have to just kind of read the fact pattern and kind of decide whether that was done in good faith or bad faith. In this particular fact pattern, Carl asked Dan to agree to charge a lower price, right? Why? Because Carl decided that making a profit of 5 cents per donut was not enough, right? So he wanted to he wanted Dan to charge a lower price because he wasn't making enough money. That sounds like bad faith, right? And if Dan wants to sue Carl because Carl wanted Dan to lower his price and and Dan didn't want to, right? Again, reading a little bit into the fact pattern again. So Carl asked Dan to lower his price. Dan refused. And as a result of refusal, Carl stopped selling donuts in his coffee shop and switched to other pastries. He wasn't happy that he wasn't making enough money, but they already had a requirements contract, right? And they have a good faith element. They must satisfy the good faith element, not on not asking for unreasonably disproportionate element, and they have to do their best in trying to supply and to try to sell. And the fact that a party decides it's too expensive and I'm not enough making enough profit and I'm not gonna get into that requirements anymore, that would be a breach, right? And because Carl breached, Dan is going to sue. And because Carl breached in bad faith, Dan will probably win in this fact pattern. So let's look at A. Dan, because if Dan sues Carl for breach of contract, who will prevail? Dan, because the elimination by Carl of his requirements of donuts to not occur in good faith. Right. We talked about good faith like 10 times already. In previous to this answer, a couple questions ago, I told you that they love to write out the right element in the right answer choice, right? And we talked about good faith and what look what's going on in question A. They literally wrote out good faith, right? So then would prevail for breach of contract against Carl, right? Because Carl didn't act in good faith. He raised the price because he wasn't making enough profit. And what did he do after that? He stopped selling donuts, even though they both contracted, you know, a certain amount. One side promising to supply a certain amount, and the other party doing their best to sell. So A is the right answer, but let's look at B. Then, because under the agreement, Carl had an absolute obligation to have requirements of approximately 50 dozen donuts per week, right? Absolute obligation. I don't really like that word. If it's like too like extreme, they're usually not the right answer. So I would, even though, you know, some people may like B, absolute obligation right away should indicate that's not the right answer. And we know that Carl is answer choices C and D that talk about Carl are going to be wrong. But let's look at it. Carl, because the inadequate profit on donut sales was a permissible reason for Carl's eliminating his requirements of donuts. That's wrong. Because inadequate profit on donut sales, you know, was something that was foreseeable when they both contracted under a requirements contract. And just because you're not making enough profit and throwing away that contract, that would be in bad faith. So C is wrong. D, call because a buyer under a requirements contract may properly eliminate his requirements for any reason. You know this is wrong because they tell you a party can eliminate his requirements contract for any reason. Again, that's one of those extreme answers that should indicate right away it's the wrong answer, right? So the last question for this section, assume that in May, Carl sold Carl's coffee shop to Ed, assigning his rights and delegating his duties under the contract with Dan to Ed. Ed decided to continue using the name Carl's Coffee Shop when Dan was notified of the sale. He refused to supply donuts to Ed for Carl's Coffee Shop. What are Ed's rights, if any, against Dan for the balance of the year? Okay, so Carl sold his coffee shop to Ed, right? And assigned all his rights and even delegated his duties under the contract with Dan to Ed, right? So, what do we know about assignments? Assignments are generally valid, right? Unless, you know, it substantially, materially changes the other party's obligation, right? Or like if in other words, if it becomes really burdensome, if the original contracting party ends up assigning his rights and duties to somebody, and because of this assignment, right? If the other party, his performance becomes extremely burdensome, then in those cases, assignment wouldn't be valid. Another situation in which assignment wouldn't be valid is if the assignment or the original assigner's job was something that was of a personal like taste, meaning like if he was like an artist and he was, you know, hired for his reputation or his skill, right? Because as an artist, you can't really assign your job if somebody contracted you because you're a known person in the art world, right? If somebody hired you, paid you money, and you have a contract with them, and you're supposed to give them like 5 art pieces because they know you by name, your skills and reputation, you can't really assign that your rights, right? And delegate your duty to somebody else because the party who contracted you did it because of your, you know, your reputation or your skill. So those two situations wouldn't make assignment valid. But in this case, he was a Carl was a coffee shop owner, right? And by assigning his rights and delegations to another person, Ed, it didn't make the other party's performance burdensome, right? And also, this wasn't really a assignment that required a person's reputation or skill, right? So because those two things wouldn't get in the way of an assignment, this assignment would generally be valid, right? And the person, the assignee here, who is Ed, would have the same rights as the assignor, who is Carl. So if Carl had a breach of contract case against Ed or Dan, then Ed would also have the same rights to sue Dan under the breach of contract case, right? So, what are Ed's rights, if any, against Dan for the balance of the year 1980? Okay, so if Dan didn't perform previous to this assigning and delegation of rights and duties, right? Carl would have a breach of contract case against Dan. But because Carl ended up assigning his rights and duties, Ed would also have the same rights against Dan as if same rights and defenses as Carl would have against Dan, right? I know this is like the last question, and I've been talking a lot, so I'm kind of, my mind is a little bit jumbled up, but this assignment is valid, right? And I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to say is that the assignee has the same rights against the obligor as the same rights that a signor would have against his own old contracting party, who's Dan in this case, right? So let's look at question answer A. Ed has no rights against Dan. That's wrong because Ed has same rights as what Carl would have against Dan. So A is wrong. Let's look at B. Ed is entitled to have Dan supply Ed's requirements of donuts for Carl's coffee shop, but not in a quantity unreasonably disproportionate to Carl's normal requirements before he sold it to Ed, right? So Ed is entitled to have Dan supply Ed's requirements of donuts for Carl's coffee shop because this assignment is valid. But they tell you that that assignment doesn't mean that Ed can ask for an amount that is unreasonably disproportionate because, as you know, as I've said many, many times in this video, that for a requirements contract, if a party asks for a amount that is unreasonably disproportionate, then the other party have the right to sue the person who's asking for disproportionate amount. So they tell you that Ed does have the right to the requirements that Carl would have, Carl would have had against Dan, but he can't ask for unreasonably disproportionate amount. So B is the answer, right? Let's just look at C and D. Ed is entitled to have Dan supply whatever quantity of donuts Ed might order for Carl's coffee shop, but Ed is free to buy donuts elsewhere. Well, if Ed is entitled to have Dan supply whatever quantity of donuts, that's wrong because it needs to be close to the stated estimate. If it's 50, it needs to be close to 50, right? Just like in the previous question, if a party to a requirements contract was, if the stated estimate was 50 and asked for 75, that wouldn't be valid, right? But here they're saying whatever quantity of donuts, that's the wrong answer. Let's look at D. Ed is entitled to have Dan supply whatever requirements of donuts Ed might have for Carl's coffee shop. That's wrong, right? They're also, again, testing your knowledge for a unreasonably disproportionate amount. And here they're saying, Ed is entitled to have Dan supply any, like 1,000 when the stated estimate was 50. You can't do that. That would not be a valid requirements contract under the UCC. So again, this took longer than I expected. I thought that I could finish this within an hour, but I guess going over 10, 11 questions, reading them, trying to explain my reasoning is taking longer than I expected. But again, just like in the previous video, I hope that by kind of watching and seeing and kind of picking my brain on how I arrive at each answer for every one of these questions, I hope that if some of you do not have the financial means to, get adaptive bar or bar max, because I understand, when you're like, not doing well financially, like $400-500 can mean a lot, you know. But I hope that these videos can help those who are in need of more finances and just cannot afford to hire a tutor or purchase a program for $500. I hope that by watching these videos that it can first of all help you pass the baby bar exam, and second save you money, and third just have a better understanding of how these baby bar questions work, and hopefully it'll carry forward to your future bar exam, and also help out in your classes, your second, third, and fourth year classes. And I really hope that this video was also beneficial for you. So with that, I thank you for watching a long video, almost hour and 40 minutes now. And if you have any questions, if they're legitimate, leave a comment and I'll try to respond. If you disagree with any of my reasoning also, you can also leave a comment and I'll try to respond. Again, I may not be 100% in my understanding of the three subjects, because it's been about 5 months since I took the baby bar exam, but I tried my best with what I remember, and I don't think that I was too off today either. So I thank you again, and I'll see you in the next video.